So, hello everyone here in person and online. Welcome to the last fall conversation of the fall 2025. If some of you that are joining new to this, the fall conversations are a space for creating more community of practice around the interdisciplinary design research, connecting multiple disciplines. Just a shout out to the team that has helped put this event together and the previous as well. My name is Stefania Chiliot. I'm the Associate Director here at the Center for Design. And together with the team, we hope you can continue to enjoy this series of events. As I mentioned, we have a series of past events that involved different topics and different communities. So hopefully we can continue to create these moments throughout the upcoming years. Thank you for making the fall a nice series of events. These are some of the topics that we had discussed in the previous months. And today, without further ado, we're going to be talking about Afro-Indigenous perspectives on context-driven design, moderated by our wonderful Alpha Arsano, assistant professor in the School of Architecture and currently fellow at the Center for Design. And with no further ado, I'll pass the mic to you so you can introduce our wonderful speakers.
Thank you, Stefania. Let me try to share screen. So first, I want to say welcome to everyone for joining our Afro-Indigenous Perspective of Context-Driven Design panel. I also want to thank Center for Design. They have been a great support in organizing this panel. The image I'm showing at the background, it's the first hotel in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, that was built in 1907. I like to show it because it's a good example to show the embodiment of some of the traditional vernacular styles we know in a very contemporary manner for the time. So we'll come back to the conversation later. I would like to note before we proceed, this is one of the first panels of an upcoming series of conversations that are being organized as part of the Cool Cities Design Sprint. That is in collaboration between CAMDI and the Provost Office Sustainability Advisory Team. So we're here for having more conversations. Please come join us on January 16 and 23. I'd also like to invite students to use the QR code, learn more about it, register for the design sprint. There are very interesting perks to it, including earning a sustainability badge for participation. So coming back to our conversation today, the big challenge we see here is we've seen Indigenous knowledge, vernacular style being marginalized from the way we teach in research, the way projects are celebrated globally, and because traditional styles are being conflated with poverty, sometimes we see this being eroded from policy support and people having pride in them. So in this panel, we want to examine the challenges and opportunities of Indigenous design principles using the Afro-centric lens as a perspective. So our speakers will be talking about how socio-cultural context translate into design. They'll be talking about the process of heritage creation and preservation. We'll have a conversation on resilience building through building structures, as well as ecological benefits of Indigenous systems. Let me first introduce our panelists. Briefly, you learn they have done great things. You find their extended bios online. Mohamed Ismail, he is a building scientist and educator. Currently, he's an assistant professor at UVA. He is the director of the Open Structures Group, research group. He's the co-founder of Forma Systems. Fisiha Likke, he is an artist, designer, educator. He's an assistant professor of design at Lesley University. He's also a PhD candidate here at Kamdi. Most importantly, he's also my husband. And we have Killion Mokwete. Most of you already know Killion. He's doing amazing work here around the campus, and on the website, we use the image he took personally in Pornobo, Benin. He's a cultural designer, Riba architect, and educator. He's the co-founder of the Adaptive and Social Impact Collective. He's an assistant professor here at Nmadili at the School of Architecture. And we have Nmadili Okwumabu joining us online. She's currently in Abuja, where she's running the CPDI, that's the Community Planning and Design Initiative. She also has a couple other associated organizations she runs. She's a cultural designer, urbanist, and educator. She also comes to different universities here in the US for lectures and running some courses. So she's going to give us really great overview of the work she's been doing with her organizations. So just briefly, the schedule for today would we would have 8 minutes for each speaker. So they have so much to say. So we may interrupt them in between. So we will come back to their slides during conversation, and that would be followed up by a moderated conversation here on the panel, and then we would open it up for the audience in the last 15 minutes. Okay, so we're gonna start with Mo. Mo, you can take it over for me.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Alpha. Thank you so much for the introduction. I am an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Virginia, and I'm really excited to hear what everyone else has to say, so I will try my best to keep it short, but I think inevitably we all have way too much to say in these slides. So I would have cut it down, but I didn't have enough time, so I'm going to try my best here. It is so great to be back in Northeastern, so thank you, Alpha, for the invitation. It's also been a good excuse to come back to Boston. I'm going to talk a little bit about my interest more than my work. So this just might kind of bounce around a little bit. So I apologize in advance if I lose you, but I will try my best to keep it all in one line. This is a photo I took in Khartoum, Sudan, where my family is originally from. In front is a clay zero pot, which is a public amenity where people will basically pour water for anybody walking by to come get some. It's an ancient tradition. It's also an ancient technology. There's a pinhole at the bottom that allows water to drip. And so through evaporative cooling, this water actually remains cool no matter what the weather is outside. In the background, you see a also common site in Khartoum, Sudan, which is a series of concrete frame structures that are usually incomplete. This was before the Civil War that broke out in 2019, 2020. So I'm not even sure if it looks like this anymore. But at the time, I always found it interesting that we had this friction between the ancient technology and the existing. Ultimately, what people desire is a concrete frame house, but they can't build it, they can't afford it. And so a lot of my research became about responding to this need while also learning from what's around us. Essentially, how can we have sustainable development? And to me, it needs to have local solutions to global problems, ultimately. This is especially important when we're given the challenges of growing populations. This is a map of the fastest growing cities over the next 80 years. And what you'll see is that 90% of urban population growth is expected to occur in Asia and Africa in the next 40 years. So this is not necessarily a problem of the global north or developed world. This is a problem for down south. This is also both an academic and personal interest. All of these plots that I'm pulling out have some significance to me. They're where my family is from. It's where I grew up. It's where my parents live. And they all show up on this map at one point. So this is where I was raised. It's a very sketchy map. This is the Philippines, and it's zooming into the south of Luzon, where I grew up on Mount Makiling, which is a semi-dormant volcano in a rainforest. And we had earthquakes about once a month, 20 typhoons a year. But what I want to point out is that there was a building called St. Mark's Chapel. That's from where I grew up. I would pass by this really enchanting structure at least twice a day. It was an 8-minute drive from my house. And there were a lot of things that I loved about it before I even studied design. I always wondered about the genius behind it because there are these really interesting points. It's tropical rainforest, so there's no point in blocking out the rain because they allow it in. Water is allowed to flow in and around through these concrete channels that are embedded in the ground. You hear it, you see it, you feel it, and it's all cast in stone and concrete, and the greenery takes over whatever. Yeah. But what's really interesting to me as someone who studied structural engineering and then went on to do structural design was the scale of this crazy cantilever roof. I could never quite figure out how it was standing before I went to school. So how is something so big supported by a single column on a seismically active volume? That's what I was wondering. Turns out with some education, I started to recognize some of the solutions. It actually has like a buttress on the Gothic cathedral where you always put statues to kind of offset the weight of the load transfer. You can kind of see in the small diagram the arrows of the force moving from the top to the bottom. In a sense, that's what that giant oversized cross is doing. There's a sculptural cross and it's bringing the weight down and stabilizing it. The column also tapers towards the bottom. So there's actually more stability for overturning moments. And the roof tapers towards the end. So you can kind of see that it gets really thick towards the column and then it gets thinner and thinner, which both gives the illusion of it looking lighter, looking like it's floating, but also is structural. There's material significance to it. They're saving material. All of this I worked at after years of schooling, but I still don't know who designed it, which I always found crazy. There's two possible theories that I've come across. One is Leandro Locsin, who was a very influential Filipino architect who designed the National Arts Center just up the road. It's this beautiful pyramid-like stadium building. I've also read comments on Instagram posts of people claiming that it was designed by the beloved Filipino abstract painter, Vicente Manansala. Either way, it was likely built between the 1960s and 1970s, but I don't know who did it. When we talk about this period of time, there are a lot of projects that probably come to mind. For most of you, you probably recognize all of these buildings. I don't necessarily have to put the name up. In fact, these are all mostly within a few hours drive of here in Boston, not the Salt Center, obviously that's in California, but the rest of it's around here. But when we step back from the American context and zoom out, you can see a lot of what was happening around the world. And a lot of these works of expressive concrete architecture actually started to coincide with the independence of many countries. In fact, 1960 is often referred to as the year of Africa, when 17 countries gained independence from colonial rule all at once. So the narrative we often hear with regards to post-colonial concrete architecture is that the modernists went south. You hear names like Le Corbusier, Maxwell Fry, Koningsberger, Jane Drew, and others who worked to spread this idea of tropical modernism as a gift, a benevolent gift down to people in the South. And they were building exciting new public buildings throughout the world. This was a map from Africa, Big Chance, Big Change exhibit that went up in 2014. It was influential, a lot of people saw it, but it really focused on this movement of north to south. I want to focus on a few of those people real quick for a moment, just snapshots. Otto Koningsberger was trained in architecture and planning in Berlin before his 1933 exile during World War II to Cairo, where he worked in archaeology. He was invited to Mysore, India by the local leader, and he became a chief architect until India's independence, and then was appointed federal director of housing in the new Indian Ministry of Health. What's interesting is that this actually reflects, in my opinion, Akil's Bembe's theory on the post-colony that colonial power never fully disappears after independence. People who were involved beforehand often are involved after independence. And so he talks about, so it's also really interesting to me that Koningsberger actually recommends Fry and Drew, Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, who I'll bring up in a second, for the design of Chandigarh with the Corbusier in 1951. He also may have invited Louis Kahn to work on the Indian Institute of Management. So he was kind of one of the first people that brought a lot of these European voices down. When the partitioning happened, 7.5 million people fled Pakistan, and there was a huge issue with housing, affordable housing. And so Prime Minister Nehru hired Koningsberger to design the first mass-scale, mass-produced prefab housing in India. He designed this prototype of foamed concrete panels that reduced the amount of concrete. It was revolutionary technology. It was meant to embody modernism's utopian ideals, and it was widespread, but it led to structural failures and his resignation in 1951. And so this is just a snippet of some of the papers that fell through, where basically a lot of people idolized this, but it was a huge failure. He moved to London and established the Department of Tropical Architecture, BAA, and then that led to people like Maxwell Fry, Jane Drew, et cetera, moving outwards. And so he also worked with the UN housing plan for the South on tropical housing, kind of became the world leader in tropical modernism, wrote this manual. Maxwell Fry and Drew, they were part of the same group. They helped found this modern architectural research group, which also was sort of the British spin-off of the French International Modernism group. And Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, interestingly, were brought in before a lot of these countries gained colonial independence from colonial rule. So they were given an excuse to experiment while also technically being part of the British colonial relationship. And so it's interesting to see them both as like modernist leaders that we were all very proud of and excited about, but they ultimately were embodying a lot of the principles, which is represented in this. You have 800 different tribal lands that were sort of partitioned somewhat arbitrarily, and they became architectural tools for that. And so they worked on educational commissions, they imported materials and local labor, but ultimately were going for historical looks and historical projects. And so they significantly contributed to this expansion of modernism. So I'm going to wrap up in a second, but I just want to talk about one of my favorites who does not show up in that exhibition, which is Joseph Allen Stein. He was an American architect who was working on regional modernism. Basically, how do you make things that are environmentally sustainable and affordable? And he actually moved to India on his own to work with local architects. Benjamin Polk was also a emigre from the Bay Area of California, and Binoy Chatterjee was an amazing Indian engineer, or Bengali engineer, sorry. And they started to experiment and resulted in really amazing structures like the India International Center, where they focused on affordability. There was an expression in context, an attempt to conserve material. You build massive structures with small elements, sort of recognizing the constraints of working in India at the time, which kind of show up in these pictures where they weren't using trucks, they weren't using giant buckets, they were using people and their heads for a lot of the concrete casting. So yes, modernists went south to spread the gospel of modernism, but like a lot of narratives in a typical Western education, this is a pretty incomplete story. And so I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about this. I just want to say that there are often a lot of projects by foreign architects that are exemplified, but I do think that if we look a little bit deeper, there are architects and engineers from all these regions in the same period who were not acknowledged at their time. And so that's a big part of what I've worked on, where even my own house in the Philippines was an example of tropical modernism, if you want to call it that, by local architects who, when they were working on the design of the International Rice Research Institute, the Ford Foundation hired an American architect to come and advise them, and said that they were so good, he wished he had them in his shop in New York. And so at the time, they were talented, they were accomplished, and they were doing things that still stood the test of time. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
That if I could use my computer.
But you don't use Zoom yet, so it's okay. Let's just go.
Okay.
I can give you.
Well, I don't know how you did all that in 6 minutes.
That was half of my slides.
Wow.
I didn't even go through the second half. But thank you, I'm glad.
I'm still digesting.
I still went up to the broccoli, so I apologize.
No,
So I can actually look at the. Yeah, I think, yeah. I have to look at the.
you want to sit here?
Yeah, that's if I can reach the. Not the adapter, right?
What do you mean?
I have to use the, yeah.
Oh, for your.
Yeah.
No, we don't have that adapter. It's on Zoom.
Yeah.
It's on Zoom. Okay, so let me.
But you guys hear this? There's a way to do it.
It's a way to do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there the.
Yeah. I can actually, yeah, I can show.
One of the years.
Did I have, the adapter?
No,
Those are not working.
hook it up to the TV,
Yeah.
that's what's being run in the Zoom meeting right now. It's already using.
Other option is, you can have your laptop, you have the notes on the others.
Yeah, and those and follow the scripts because.
They stay on that.
The way.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So,
Nice.
yeah. Oh,
You can see your note.
I'll need to ask
There
you
you go.
for that.
I can learn all
Thank you. Yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Wow.
Learn that too, because usually I use my adapter, so.
I'll show you.
Okay. With my water. Stop. Hang me now. Yeah. Hello again. I'm going to be really talking about how to explore how to place-based indigenous knowledge, to be, in a contemporary architecture, or which is basically my PhD studies on water conservation strategies. So I'm going to be using actually between the water conservation strategy as well as our actually how architecture actually how indigenous knowledge actually inform the architecture. So my really argument is very simple. Indigenous practices are not relics of the past, but rather they are functional ecological technologies. So when we translate them thoughtfully, we are activating the design intelligence that is perfectly suited for a climate future. Okay. So, why translation matters, really? Cities across majority world, or what we call actually the global south, Addis Ababa, which is the case study that I'm actually working on, is really facing a growing water scarcity. And at the same time, really possess thousands of knowledge that's actually, within it's embedded or actually within the culture that's actually really talking about the terracing, culture, hydrological knowledge and communal road systems. You're talking about how to store waters. And this is symbolical, spatial orders. So the question is not whether the indigenous knowledge matters, but how do we translate them into a contemporary design without kind of romanticizing it or without really distorting it? So in a way, it's not really about asking, how to preserve them. Preservation definitely has its own knowledge, but really, how do we actually activate them? That's the concept that basically that I'm referring to. So I am thinking it through this three translation framework or thinking framework, which is the concept of environmental logic that really talk about, what's the context, what's actually, how did the land really teaches us, what are the ecological or the climate and the condition shapes the traditional knowledge or the traditional practice. And the element of the graphic, what's the design grammar, which is basically that speaks about space, or the hydrological language embedded in the traditions, where you decide how to think, about the cultural idea becomes, the space or the hydrological strategy. And then, of course, the third element would be the contemporary applications. How did this logic inform modern architecture or water systems in general? And then this is where you think about actually, okay, what happened? So what? What is, and how did the principles are actually work here? The element of actually functions, instead of actually thinking about function, but we really focus on the symbolism of it. Or how do we actually scale up the principle of an idea, or the element of actually, how do we become, are we actually becoming more materially honest? Or are we thinking about the logic? Or are we actually thinking about the thing itself, which is the thing, the material that we are actually working on? And then, of course, the element of actually ecological reciprocity, which is how, the design is the driver of the element. And that's the last one that I can probably talk about is how do you co-produce, how do you actually co-produce with the expert, and how do you actually the traditional how do you bring the traditional knowledge as well as actually the experts together in order to actually make your design or your project more durable. So let's start with the concept. Concept people that are actually the southern part of Ethiopia. It's actually the northern part of Nairobi. Kenya. And their landscape really demonstrate the engineering precision, really shaped by necessity. And they're really dealing with steep slopes, as you can see, and there's actually a fragile soil, and there is an erratic rainfall. So in terms of the environmental logic now, okay, how do they prevent erosion? And how do they actually store water using, this steep slopes? And how do they stabilize, the land in order to actually maintain their livelihoods? And in terms of actually the design grammar, you can also thinking about, of course, they use the local material, which is actually stones, the dry stones. And they're using the system called retaining walls. And they also have, a terrace-based, system that actually helps as an infiltration bed or infiltration pockets. So thinking about now, how do we translate that? The picture, the photo that you're actually use is the first one basically shows the actual landscape, and that's actually the World Heritage. It's actually a UNESCO Heritage Site, by the way. And the third image that you're looking at are actually now currently in the city of Addis. The river shades are actually built by using the Konso tradition, the Konso tribes, making these rivers that are actually making the as an infiltration bed. And here are some of the photos that I took while I was actually there. I was there last month, and at the same time last year, just try to do with my PhD thesis. And here are, as you can see, the bottom right, the bottom left. We could look at the cities, and the cities that are actually upon high elevations. They're really working around the river sheds in order to actually the water to be more infiltrated and so forth. The other one is Har. Har is actually the eastern part of the Ethiopian cities, and really offer different lessons here. And water as a scared urban infiltrations. And in terms of its environmental logic, so what you have to think about is here you have a severe water scarcity, which is basically a drought cycle. And the urban is very dense settlements. And then you have a cultural value that's actually using purity or ritual, cleanness that uses water 5 times a day in order to actually cleanse, themselves, because in the religion of Muslims, as you can see. So water becomes actually an element. And now the way how they are actually containing their water is basically they're using the underground cisterns or water tanks within the, as you can see it on the diagrams. And they actually looking at the courtyard catchment systems, like a drainage system within the courtyard. And they also have a technique or systems called the first flush filtration. The water's being the first water's being filtered while they are actually, of course, storing that comes after. In terms of the translations of the contemporary design, they're thinking about the basement level as an integrated housing infrastructure, which actually can use as a cooling structure, as well as actually as a storage element. And here is a contemporary design of it that they're actually using. Look at the courtyard systems that's actually contain water in the courtyard and also infiltrates. And they're also using a decentralized water that can be used for toilets or irrigation purposes or hydration. Let me ask that for the sake of time. So let me talk about the Zagwe motifs. This is actually the Ethiopian Cross Zagwe dynasty that's actually within the 13th century, 12th centuries, that really offer something very different in terms of its symbolic, geometry that really encode, spatial elements. And of course, in terms of the environmental logics, of course, they're thinking about the cosmology as, the religious motives, and they have the orientations of religions, and they also using a fractal, property. And this is actually a design by an architect who's actually from Spain, I believe, yes, and who designed that are actually in this interesting infrastructure using, of course, the Zagwe fractal property as an envelope that really cools, the building, and that definitely led actually light coming into the building as well. So it's an interesting example that I thought that would really translate well. And maybe the last one, it's a beautiful comparison between the Lalibela architecture. You might be familiar with this religious, monolithic. Basically, that's done about 900, 800 years ago in Ethiopia. It's a religious, site. And as you can see, it is an architecture that's really carved into the land in a subtractive mass that really cools, shelter, and then channel water. And then you can look at the movement is basically going downward. It's basically, accepting the, Christianity as it's more of an humbling experience as you go down. And then, of course, it's actually used as ritual. Still, currently, are actually used as a ritual. And the other ones that are actually recently built, not even 10 years, maybe 15 years, I'm not exactly sure when it was built. But it is a building that I thought that really take an idea from this, the indigenous, knowledge that really looking at, it's an additive systems. It's really rebirthing, Addis is actually a very high elevated cities, and it's kind of mimicking that. And at the same time, it really protects, it managed runoff. It invite definitely an airflow, and it is choreographed. As you can see, it's very open. As you're actually walking on the stairs, you're looking at the cities. It definitely communicate with the, and express a contemporary Ethiopian identity in a way, while it's still kind of listening, echoing the structure that we're having. So I'm going to pass that one as well. So I guess in short, what I am thinking about is how do you translate a system, not a symbols? And how do you really understand the environmental logic before designing, the thing or the forms? And it's all about really scaling up the principle, not the artifact. And then, of course, the element of actually in a co-producing it with the cultural traditions. And success usually measures in terms of sustainability, in terms of conservation or performance rather than actually. So in short, really, how do you really translate idea or wisdom or logic than, the aesthetics? Thank you. I don't know if I finished it on time. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Peter.
Yeah, I will be the same ones.
The same. Okay.
Yeah, but I don't have any note. I just share the screen so I can have 2 minute slides.
I don't know if I passed 10 minutes. 10 minutes? 13. Yeah, no, I can hope.
Great. So I have 2 minute slides, but because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is actually down the hall, I'll just speed through so that I'm not dwelling too much, so I can try and keep myself to the 8 minutes. So the work that I'm going to present is, in the broader sense, my area of research really is interested in the idea of community resilience, but through the lens of cultural heritage. There is research that shows that communities that have strong cultural identity and they have a connection to their heritage tend to bounce back and forward better during times of adversity. For example, if you have natural disasters, communities that have a strong sense of identity and community, they have longer community resilience than those that are not cohesive. So in that respect, my work, through this kind of broader sense of cultural heritage types between kind of tangible and intangible, are more focused around buildings, and especially kind of buildings that are, facing endangered buildings in sub-Saharan Africa. So the two broad types in this kind of broad strokes, the two broad types that I'm really interested in is traditional buildings. And within traditional buildings, you find vernacular types. And as you know, vernacular buildings in Africa vary greatly depending on where you are. And mostly they're driven by really rich stories of how people live, how people worship, and how people make and produce. And a lot of these, they obviously date pre-colonial times. The second typology that I'm interested in is the colonial building typology, which, as you know, they're buildings that were built during colonial times, and they all also have stories that some often mostly are painful. But nevertheless, those are important stories that tell what happened during the colonial times in Africa. So these are kind of the two broad categories that I'm interested in, mostly because, again, these are the buildings that are mostly facing danger or threat of being either demolished or mostly affected through pressures of urban development, rapid urban development, and also other pressures that we see today. I think more mentioned, conflict that's happening in Sudan. It's a lot of these, really rich heritage buildings are being lost. So essentially, my kind of research is looking at how can we leverage, as you'll see later on, leverage modern digital technologies, social participation, and create a digital archive. That's a kind of starting point of making sure that we don't lose most of these heritage that we have. The current pilot that we started working on, and this is part of what the exhibition updates, but is work that we've done in Benin. Why Benin? Actually, this is a long story that goes way back to when I was doing work in Togo, where I was interested in the kind of Takienta buildings that are the mud towers that are built by communities there. And when I was looking to kind of start this research, I was kind of encouraged to look at urban centers as a starting point, just because it might have a lot more depth and attract more funding. So Benin, Zanzibar, those were all areas that were in contention. We ended up looking at Benin. Just briefly, I won't go too much into the history of Benin. Again, you can look at some of the information we had there. In terms of the stories and the narratives, Benin was one of the many countries in that part of the world that had first a very rich history in kind of African powerful kingdoms that preceded colonial times. And then during colonial times as well played a critical role as being the launching pad for the transatlantic slavery that happened. But later on also became one of the places where people who were formerly enslaved and came back and resettled in parts of Africa actually settled in Benin as well. So one particular building typology, which is the Afro-Brazilian or the so-called Aguda buildings, which is, it falls within the colonial building typology. These were all buildings that were built by formerly enslaved people who returned and settled in Benin. Not only Benin, but also settled in Togo, Ghana, Nigeria. And they built this, building. This is a mosque in Benin, which was built with a replica in Nigeria as well. The Nigerian mosque is already demolished. But a lot of this, as you can see, they borrow and leverage kind of the Baroque style of construction that was the style of building that a lot of the formerly enslaved people would be used as forced labor to build cities in Brazil, knew how to build. And so when they came back, they leveraged some of those, and as you see, with also local ways of building to create a new style of architecture that identify their community. So this past August, actually, I did a road trip, which is part of a book project that I'm working on, specifically focusing on this kind of Afro-Brazilian architecture. That, as you can see, kind of starting from Lome, Togo, going to Benin, ended up in Nigeria to see, again, this is where most of the people who returned settled. And you can see they have a whole lot of these buildings that they built across that coast, the so-called Bight of Benin. And generally, there is differences in not necessarily the style, but the scale. One thing that I'm learning is that actually the builders that we're building this were mostly almost like bands. They were traveling bands that were hired. If you have money and wanted to build one of these buildings, you hired these builders that had a way of educating themselves and keeping that education within the community. So they traveled across that coast making this building. And you can't find any blueprints, but it was interesting to learn how these buildings were built. And I'll show you a little bit what are some of the current status of it. anyway, I'll skip through this map, but this is just to show the scale at which people were transported across that part of Africa into the Americas, and again to emphasize the Afro-Brazilian typology, which is built by people who were formerly enslaved in Brazil. 40% of all people who were enslaved ended up in Brazil. So Brazil actually had a big population with transported from parts of Africa. One thing that I want to highlight, I talked about stories and narratives. The group that returned, they're called Agudas because actually it's not a homogeneous group of people that included both people who were in Brazil, but people also who never left. And interestingly enough, people who actually participated in the original slavery itself. One example, for example, is Francisco de Souza, who is legendary in those parts of the world, where he was so-called Chacha. So he had a deal with the king of the Dahomey kingdom in Benin to be the one slave catcher. So when people returned and trying to settle, he had all this land that he had, and all of a sudden he became a person who was able to give people who were returning land. They were returning to places where, in most cases, they were not welcome and they didn't have land. So they ended up again having to live and form communities with people like him who never left and participated in it. So these kind of narratives are really important part of the stories that has to be told in terms of how and what these buildings are. So anyway, this is it's part of a study where I was looking at, for example, the mosque. As you can see, the mosque is really almost not a direct copy, but you can see the buildings that it's kind of borrowing from in Brazil. And again, this is something that one of the questions that I've been asked is why would people return and kind of have this things that can remind them of what they went through. And one of the research that I'm reading, it's a lot of this was. But A, people were coming back to places where they were actually not welcome. B, these were some of the skills that they had. And the third one, which I found interesting, was that because people faced stigma, the idea of building something unique and something for themselves was a strong component of why they built in a kind of a separate way that was not synonymous with traditional buildings. So anyway, so this is a good example of the sobrado type building on the right, where these were largely the buildings that we found in Bahia State in Brazil, where much of the enslavement was happening, and the structure and the architecture of it really influenced the Afro-Brazilian ways in which they built in Benin, but also in Benin they kind of introduced courtyards, which, as you know, courtyards in the kind of tropics were a big way of organizing communities. So it wasn't just kind of copying like for like, but it was copying those and adapting them to how they would live. The bottom picture here is a Afro-Brazilian building in Nigeria, right? So I'll flip through this example. So these are pictures that I've been taking through my study and documentation in Brazil that shows the different status of this building and typologies. And also they produced a lot of carbon copies. So they became so successful that rich people also commissioned these builders to build themselves carbon copies of these. So you have these carbon copies that were built by Afro-Brazilians, but not necessarily owned by Afro-Brazilian communities. So the current state of these buildings, most of them are in decline. They are all mostly falling apart due to various reasons. One of them being that during the revolution in the 1970s, the Afro-Brazilian community were the first to be blamed for colonialism generally. And a lot of them were driven from their homes and therefore left a lot of these buildings unattended, and also issues of materialism. So anyway, let me flip through the current research that we're doing. As I mentioned, we're leveraging technology and social participation. And so far, we've been able to document and digitize about 8 buildings, but not only Afro-Brazilians, but also including traditional buildings, as I mentioned, in Portugal. And these, as you can see later on in the exhibition, uses various ways of documenting LiDAR scanning, drone LiDAR scanning, and then working to digitize those. I'll skip through that. And so anyway, I think maybe I'll end here, that the idea of the documentation was not only to create digital archive, but also to explore ways in which we can make these archives accessible. So one of the things that we're experimenting with is how can we animate, how can we create ways in which people can immerse themselves into these buildings and learn the story. So part of the documentation was also the stories that people were telling, and we're trying to kind of embed those stories into VR-enabled models that can be able to kind of bring all of these stories together in a way that can be shareable rather than just as an archival material. And I think I will end here. And lastly, the one thing that we have communities that out of the work that we've been doing, they're interested in actually rehabilitating these buildings based on the information that we've gathered. And so part of what we're working right now is to work with those communities to help them create as-built drawings and work through visioning with them on how they can rebuild these buildings going into the future. Maybe I'll stop there. I know that I've kind of been all over the place, but that's the work that we're doing.
Natalie, would you like to share, or would you like me to share the slides from here?
Let me try.
Yeah, if you could share, that could be easy for you.
Okay. Oops. All right. Are you all seeing?
Yeah.
Mhm.
You could use presenter mode if you like.
Okay. Let me 1 second. Slideshow. Okay, how are we doing?
Yeah, we're good.
Great. Thank you.
Good? Oh, all right. So let me jump in. Let me see if I can talk fast in 8 minutes. Yes, so you all know, yes, Nmadili Okwumabu, CPD Africa. And I'll start out reading the preface, or preface, on what accent I'm going to use. In the 1900s, most African Indians independence from colonial rule. It was a pivotal moment to restore African-Indigenous knowledge in mainstream society, using Afro-centric curriculums, ultimately manifest the development of these new nations in their own identity. Instead, Eurocentric curriculums were created by the departing colonial educators, setting up crippling systems most African nations inherited post-independence and continue to suffer from today. In this presentation, I'll explore what can and is manifesting as Afro-Indigenous perspectives respond to context-driven architecture. Let me start out with my very quick definition of architecture. It's kind of like stage for what we're going to see in the upcoming images. Architecture is not just art and science of constructing a building. The extended definition says architecture is a reflection of the culture, lifestyle, ethics, local building materials, climate, geography, political and economic purchasing power of a people in a place. So all of these elements reflected into their built environment that gives them architecture. So architecture is not by abandoning your own culture, what's affordable to you, what you're able to maintain. It's not about abandoning that for something that's coming from outside. You find it hard to maintain, afford, or relate to. That's not what architecture is, specific place. So what CPDI did back in 2014 was to be intentional about creating a platform that will allow architects to fast track the evolution of their own design languages, culture by culture, whether in Africa or in the diaspora, right? So we did this by inviting architects from around the world to join us in design competitions. They were given design briefs, and we come up with these modern prototypes that preserve culture and are environmentally sustainable. So this was an intentional effort, fast track, right? These new languages. Say, okay, fine, we're free, we're independent. How can we create spaces that preserve our identity? If we're going to rebuild Africa in her own image, how would we do that, culture by culture? CPDI then creates these 5 lenses, 5 pillars, that if architects see as a lens, if they respond to the culture, to the aesthetics, to the spirituality, to the local materials, and how the community is engaged. They respond to the five elements in their designs that they're going to submit. They would create authentic. So, for example, Nigeria has about 250 nations within it, right? So we understand, I think we've already seen a map here. So what would the architectural languages be that will come out of Nigeria? They will be Yoruba, they would be Igbo, they will be TV, they will be Edo. Same for each African country, and also same for the African diaspora nations, right? Reflect all of these elements into their designs, and you can create something that is authentically theirs. For this presentation, I'll only focus on materials and community engagement. However, culture, aesthetics, and spirituality, very important. Aesthetics, once you see it, you know it. If you know what Igbo architecture looks like, when you see it, then you've achieved the aesthetics, right? Spirituality, you can't take away spirituality from anything in Africa. And then, of course, culture always informs the functionality of the spaces. But we'll talk about materials and community engagement. Materials on ground were typically organic, they were renewable, they were affordable, they were using materials that were right there, easy maintained, eco-friendly, low carbon footprint, they were natural, they were green, right? We already know about 40% of global warming is caused by our profession. So material-wise, Africans kind of had it figured out how to use green materials that impacted the planet at least some ways. These images here, we all talk about traditional architecture looking like this, very nostalgic. I think it's perfect architecture, right? Built from materials right there. The aesthetics tell you the story. All manners of typologies. There are thousands and thousands of examples of these typologies. So you can imagine borrowing from these shapes. But the materials, very important to create these new design languages. There's earth, there's raffia here. We have earth. Today we're doing that with round earth technology. But borrowing from these traditional materials, we can create something new. But the challenge that most Africans on ground face is the stigma attached to their building materials, right? So during the colonial era, the Europeans land, okay, what you're building is kind of primitive and savage. Let's bulldoze that and import materials from Europe and build what's civilized architecture. So that stigma is still attached to the local green materials where we're not standardizing. But if you can remove that stigma and bring dignity back to those materials and have architects learning how to use these materials and design with them, then all of a sudden you get the beautiful architecture that we see here. And a lot of times we see this in tourism and hospitality industry in East Africa, South Africa. But that's where these materials are being used with pride and dignity to tell a story that is African, right? But everybody has ways all around the world from using their local materials in new ways. Same materials with the stigma attached, but here we see it beautifully done by architects. So how do we get designers and clients to agree to using indigenous materials science philosophy in their architecture, right? It's total reprogramming why the curriculums do need to change. They need to be Africanized, Afro-centric, so we can turn out people who appreciate and understand. The fifth of our element, community engagement, which is very important. Africa was not built by having to go around the world begging for loans and grants and the World Bank. Africa was built by its people, sweat equity. The community was engaged, men and women, children, even the spirits were engaged. It was community sweat equity. That's how the continent was built. Yes, we went together to help each other to build our homes, our shrines, our palaces. After that, there's a big party to say thank you, we celebrate, and then when it's the next person's turn, we go to help. This philosophy of people coming together, culture and construction, architecture, they were one and the same. So you could be a part of your community. You didn't have to go and get 5-year degrees and get licensed and all of that. You already knew the designs that went with your culture. Women had their roles. Everybody participated. There was nothing like child labor laws. Children helped to maintain. Here is them maintaining the Jene Mosque in Mali. It was a community effort. Women, of course. So where I'm going with this, when you're talking about Afro-Indigenous contribution and that knowledge, how it has value, it's very important to bring this information back to the table, to integrate it today into what we do. Leaders like Francis Carey, Miriam Kamara, hopefully you all have heard of these people, these pioneering designers, Dios Wonko from Nigeria. They are incorporating these philosophies of materials and community engagement, and yes, aesthetics and spirituality into their works. So as we make a case for Indigenous design practice, this is how a lot of people now live in the villages. When they come, urbanization, they're moving to the cities for work. They don't have what it takes to afford to be in the city, but they come and they manage and they build this. But if they were working on their own Indigenous knowledge, they could build architecture that is much more beautiful than what they're doing now without guidance or pride in what their cultures are actually known for. Take your huts, which are simply rooms in a family compound, modernize them and have dignity. I'm a minute over, so I'm just going to show you some of the designs that have come out of our competitions. Architects using earth technology, making designs that preserve the story and the materiality. This one, the previous was by a Russian architect. This is from an architect from Republic of Benin. Taking that typology, using the materials, coming up with designs that do tell the story and are affordable, right? This design using the Edo culture from Benin. They're known for their beads. This architect takes these beads and he comes up with his Ida Cultural Impact Center. Either going to use clay bricks or wooden blocks, but again, the identity is preserved. We do exhibitions, we teach. Our philosophy is based on Dimas Wonko and Professor David Hughes. We have the Center for Afro-centric Design Advancement here at the African University of Science and Technology in Abuja, where we teach and we reprogram architects and clients to appreciate their own science and technology, their wisdom, so that it can solve problems that they're facing today, or we are all facing today in the built environment. So that was actually a little bit over 8 minutes. Thank you all. And I will stop here.
Thank you, everyone. We have some time to have some conversations. Maybe to get us started, there are very good overlaps between all the presentations. We spoke about, the lack of celebration or documentation of amazing work that has been done in different parts of the world, which are not really recognized. Fisiha talked about the principles of translation and systems rather than just, only the form. Killion talked about, heritage creation and how do we really preserve them. And Nmadili, you're talking about, the language we can use and how those could be translated into modern time design. So maybe let's pause a minute and let me give a chance for everyone to reflect on about contemporary vernacular, because we know there is so much attitude or different kinds of opinions attached to the vernacular or the traditional. Even the terms we use are sometimes prohibited. I always think about contemporary vernacular, maybe the way we even define it and the way we describe it could give some sort of leverage for anyone building now and taking it forward. So how do you envision the modern time construction to be the contemporary vernacular?
Look at me. There are questions for all of us.
It's for everyone.
And I think there's a lot to think about here. How do you envision vernacular architecture? Is that the question?
contemporary vernacular.
Contemporary vernacular.
Even finding the right term in language has been very difficult. I have difficulty really speaking in different platforms and always struggling to find the right term. And I always think maybe, there's always a vernacular, right? Wherever we are, whatever decisions communities or builders have made, they always arise a vernacular of that time, right? It's not maybe the ideal traditional version that we have in our minds, but at the end of the day, right, every city, every place, every community has its own style. But we're trying to say, how do we balance performance, being bioclimatic, being sustainable, with the aesthetical and cultural elements of the community, right? So there are all these different components we want to balance. And perhaps what would be the best way to describe that? Maybe that could help even in our design thinking.
I can go, but it won't be anything that I shared, but rather it will be something that I've been trying to do and not succeeding. I've been trying to build my mother's house for a while now. And I think maybe
could you say where?
Yeah, back from where I come from in Botswana, and I come from a tribe called Kalanga tribe. And I think one of the images that Natalie was showing there, which is those Ndebele type housing, but those are typical. That's where I grew up there. So the question was, in building my mother's house, she explicitly wanted something that was round. But the traditional way would be that you build this round huts individually. But it's just not, there's not enough land anymore to build this individually. So we kind of have to rethink, how do you still build round structures, maybe in a way that you can aggregate them, right? So they're closer together, connected. And she also definitely wanted to be roofed using thatch, which is what she's used to. So essentially, she wanted something new, but using the form she's used to and using the materials she's used to. So in material, in this instance, she wasn't so hung up with mud bricks. So that one she left me to kind of do her own thing. So anyway, the design that I'm kind of working on, and it's at wall level right now, past the window level, is kind of aggregating 5 different huts into clusters, 2 clusters that form a courtyard in the middle, which is the courtyard is part of the tree, the sacred tree, which is part of the tree in the family, that you build your homestead around a tree, right? So this idea that this tree is in the founding basis of a homestead. So aggregating all of these clusters around that tree and creating a courtyard, and therefore creating a roof. And definitely, yes, learning from how the hospitality industry is actually building, using the same material we use in a contemporary way. So anyway, I think to me that's it. It's an example of where I've been kind of struggling with how can I meet my mother's brief, but at the same time, not kind of build in the same way we're doing, which is takes a lot of land, and at the same time, it's not attainable in the way that we live today. So I don't have a definition for it, but I think the charge is how can we not romanticize vernacular buildings, but definitely leverage the materials, the forms that define what they are and who we are into modern ways of living and technologies that must come with it, which she wanted to have electricity, all of that stuff, right? So it's not an answer to your question, but at least it's an experiment that I'm still working on to try and see if I can make her happy with what she wants in a contemporary way, right? So yeah.
I mean, I totally agree with what you were saying. I guess the question would be, I think first we have to define what contemporary vernacular is based on our context. And I think that drives the whole, idea. And then we have to look at it into ourselves, what the kind of value system that we have, what are the cultures, what are the elements that we need to prioritize. And because those are the logic should be embedded in that, all the principles should be embedded in that language. Because there is no any specific answer to that anyways. Because specificity comes with specific, needs, with specific, concerns or values. But I guess as long as that you're actually true to your, the value system that you're actually on, and the needs of our contemporary, sustainable conservation or what have you. As long as that you're actually true to that, most of the, and of course materials and everything that are actually involved with that one. Just like as you said, I think it would really respond to the, the questions that you have. So that's how best to kind of digest the questions.
Natalie or Natalie?
Yeah, I think that is that's the challenge that we've faced at CPDI, is that when you are being intentional, coming up with a design that actually preserves the culture of a person or of a community, you really have to determine what those elements are. And that's why we said come up with those 5. How does mom or grandmom live? What's the functionality that she needs? What makes her comfortable in a space? If you can identify that, list that, what she finds beautiful, right? The aesthetics, the colors, the shapes. What did she like about her traditional home, aesthetics wise? And the spirituality, what are those sacred spaces? What was sacred about her traditional home? And then of course the materials. Materials are so important. We know that building with clay or earth, adobe, in Africa does keep the heat out, so you're cooler. So that comfort, right, based on the materials and the affordability. And then who all is going to be coming to the table to help build. And so if you can identify those things, we decided that those were the elements that were important. If you bring those to the table and then have an architect come up with a new translation, whether you want to call it a new culture or modern African or contemporary African or contemporary vernacular, whatever the words are, you would produce something that is authentically hers or the members of that community, right? Igbo architecture is going to be different from Do architecture, different from Zulu architecture, because when I go through those 5 elements, it's going to produce a whole different design or building or feeling, right? But it's for us to do that, I feel, community by community, have our community, our designers, our planners to sit down and try and work through those issues, so we can come up with those languages or prototypes. Yeah.
I love all these answers, so I didn't want to jump in. Just say, like your story reminds me, my dad spent 16 years trying to build a concrete house in Khartoum for his parents, and it was 16 years because it was expensive, the expertise wasn't there, and they were trying to design something that people weren't quite as familiar with. So it was a multi-story apartment building so that his parents and siblings could all move in over time. And that led me down this rabbit hole, actually partly inspired by CPDI's work and the Mud House competition in Ghana when I was a student, of people trying to reintroduce traditional materials. And I spent a lot of time designing these really cool compression-only vault structures built with low cost, low strength materials from Khartoum, and nobody cared. Like I brought it, presented it to people instead, and it just didn't look like what they wanted. And it was a great lesson in acknowledging exactly what has been said, which is how do we reach the function while still giving the dignified housing services that people need. It doesn't have to resemble what was built before. In fact, a lot of times that's not what people want. They want something that functions the same. They want a house that gives the public to private gradient and is still Muslim in the Sudanese context. And that's how I ended up working on concrete. I had no interest in concrete to start. It was a material that's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's a victim of its own success. And nowadays it's a bad guy because it's obviously a big part of the environmental degradation, but people want it and need it for very good reasons. And so what my interest has become is how do we merge the principles of indigenous craft and housing traditions of culture and construction with the things that we have and the things that people want and make it affordable and available. So it's a big question, but I think that the idea that, like, I always shy away from vernacular because it is so heavily loaded with connotations. But the idea of a contemporary vernacular to me is exactly that. It's what people need and want. And I don't believe architects or designers should be dictating what people want. We should be responding to it. in an appropriate, responsible way.
Maybe for the interest of time, allow questions from the audience, thoughts, questions, reflections.
Or if you're online, also on the chat.
Yeah. Sure.
I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on examples of urban planning policies or decision-making that is happening at like the city or community level that's maybe helping to catalyze new work that uses, traditional design typologies or materials, or are there times when there's like barriers to a project moving forward where maybe the client wants to embrace traditional building materials but is restricted by what they can finance or what's allowable with zoning?
Especially with the new cities, with the cities being built like crazy, the demand are going crazy. And that's the questions that are actually, especially with the residential building or this building and or commercial living that are actually, how do we actually find those balance that really stays true to the value, to not necessarily to preserve, but actually kind of activate the culture that we had. And that's, I guess, it's a good question to ask. And
I think that's a great question, which we also want to expand on the third panel. My sort of experience, learning, going to architecture school in Ethiopia, I have participated in different initiatives. I know Ermias also is familiar with those. A series of projects trying to implement kind of vernacular traditional styles in a more experimental style, but usually there's always impediment to try to bring them into the city. So, code-wise, standard-wise, guidelines-wise, those are not really recognized. It's very difficult to have a permitted building designed with urban construction in the middle of the city. So that goes back to maybe what Mo is saying, with the concrete buildings, it's so affordable, it's so ubiquitous, and it's so much embedded in the standards, it doesn't even allow space to explore these alternative materials or alternative ways of constructing. So I think right there's definitely a big gap in standard.
Yeah. In Botswana, I will use that example again. So the code we use, it's literally a carbon copy of Australian code.
Yeah.
Which therefore means exactly right there.
Yeah.
You eliminate a lot of the traditional materials, because the idea is that it's a performance-based code where you are saying the building should perform this. If I bring this material, then I have to prove that this material will meet the same performance that concrete can easily meet, which makes it very difficult for someone who wants to use earthen-based material to have to prove to the city that this building will have the same structural integrity as concrete. So that makes it expensive. So generally, that's the barrier that I see back home. And the only saving thing in that context that code only applies to urban and peri-urban areas. So if you're in a rural area, code is not applicable. You can do whatever you want, right? So that's where you still find traditional materials being built, but it stops short of in the urban area. So it's still I think this idea of how do we write our codes. I think it really comes back to what Nandi was saying earlier, that it's a question of how can we be in charge of not just what we build for ourselves, but also how we regulate. Because I think that's where the challenge is. Usually the regulation is they hire some consultants, go somewhere, carbon copy something, and then now we all have to conform to that. So it's a big challenge generally in most emerging economies in Africa.
I'll quickly say, I work on building technology specifically, so policy planning is obviously related, but not my specialty. But I'll mention too, one I know very little about because I've only recently been learning about it, which is in the southern state of Carolina. There's been a huge push for affordable housing, kind construction, a huge amount of finance that has gone into basically allowing people to build their own houses. And it's been incredibly successful. It reduced the homeless population significantly, while also improving the urban health situation in a state that has not been the most prosperous one in India for a very long time, and is constantly dealing with monsoons and flooding. So it's kind of a remarkable little example of a government kind of taking control of their resources and trying to make the most of it. Another system that is more specific to what I work on is incremental housing, which has been around for decades. The 60s might have been when it was introduced. It was essentially a way for governments to build in communication and conversation with communities. And it is a very promising idea where essentially you build the core of a housing unit. And then you allow for the family as they grow to expand. And so you give them the resources to support. The resources and support is the problem. That's the part where governments often fall short. And so Arena's Chile house program was part of this initiative that keeps creeping up. I didn't show it, I didn't have time, but I had some slides about work we did in Mexico, which was building off of an incremental housing initiative in Mexico City to essentially, in a way, it's kind of shortchanging people. You're saying that we're only going to spend $6,000 on a house, but the expectation is there's a promise to finance future development. And as long as that comes through, it works, but it really does. But we look a lot at the technology and we say, can we find a way to make the $6,000 house a reality and plan for future construction needs, which means designing for larger loads, designing for 3 floors instead of 1, things that allow for sustainability, even though it means a higher capital investment at the start, that you remove sort of the burden of that difficulty later on when a family might be building the remaining structure themselves. And so we try to make it as safe as possible early on. That really requires a long-term investment that is hard to see happen most of the time. Not even in the United States do we really do that.
I think the idea that we have, or the concept that we have about city itself changed. Because within the city, we have like a maximum needs. Because when you're thinking in terms of actually good, living, what have you, that change, that attitude needs to be actually changed if we are actually going for sustainable, but economically efficient. Because the fact that we're actually using material that actually doesn't stay for 100 years, I don't know who needs it for 100 years anyways. But the idea of the preservation concept itself needs to be actually changed. So that concept, we have to be a little bit more mindful of that in terms of actually thinking about urban planning in cities. So whatever. So that's what I was just thinking about.
Nmadili?
Okay, on urban planning practices or contribution to this, I know for Africa, when we talk about affordable housing, in a capitalist system where most people on the continent are not included in that system, it's going to be very hard for them to afford housing that traditionally was complementary, right? So you're a member of a community, either the elder in your family or the chief says, okay, of course you're part of this community. So land is assigned to you, apportioned to you. So land did not have a cost. And then when you're talking about the materials and the labor, that's also community-based. So I think a lot of Africans are finding themselves in a system that they don't really fit in. That's why you find the slums. I mean, the shanty towns everywhere, the villages are not looking the way they should look, because people are now forced to buy land, buy materials, buy labor. And how much money do you make? If you're earning $100 a month, what's affordable housing in that in that scenario, right? So somehow those indigenous practices have to be considered by planners, right? You're going to have to make some amount of land available to the people. You're going to have to allow them to build for themselves, guide them, have the trained architects and all guide them so they can design and build something that's upscale from what they would have done on their own. But you're going to have to make that policy. right? You can't have it on the books where something that's local or vernacular is not allowed in the city. We're not going to give you building permits for that. No, you should make concessions, right? 70% of the people are living in that category. So provide land, approve vernacular contemporary architecture, let students in school take 2 tracks. Okay, you take the track where you're coming out with your degree, where you're designing for the elite, you're going to get your 5 or 7% commission. You take the track for everybody else that cannot afford to pay you those commissions. But because they're incentives by the government, you can still earn a living as an architect or a planner, focusing on 70% of the population, right? So it really has to be intentional. Policymakers, think about these things. If you're not going to, I know in the States, we have vouchers, public housing, Section 8 vouchers. The government subsidizes housing for the poor, the needy. You don't have that in Africa, right? So what's the African system for that? So it really has to be intentional. Since urbanization is just what's happening all over, right outside my window. Yeah, people are moving in from the villages and they can't afford to be here. So what are they building outside of my window? Right? So yeah, a lot has to be considered.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It's really, this question is coming from, I have a friend who is doing some work with colonial buildings in Nigeria. One of the questions that I have asked is, or maybe ask you also for your work with in Benin, Togo, and Nigeria, if you found like, what are the general perceptions towards colonial buildings there? Are people more attuned to keeping them or like destroying them and creating more rooms to have more urban contemporary structures? I'm also wondering if these colonial buildings have like any correlation or impact on what the current space of buildings look like in Nigeria today, because if you spend some time in Lagos, you would see that a lot of buildings have like, if you divide this window into 4, that's the size of the window. So there is, concerns for ventilation and all of those things. I wonder if there is like, if that is coming from like a colonial background, or it's just like what we have come to do because there's no space or whatever. I think the last thing I was wondering I was just curious about if you found this Afro-Brazilian structures also in Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think definitely yes, Afro-Brazilian architecture in Nigeria. In fact, Nigeria and Togo were bigger than Benin. Benin was the smaller version when in their kind of high time. So there is quite some existing buildings in Lagos. I was in Lagos this past August for this study. The Waterhouse is still stands, yes, but it's in really bad shape. A lot of them are in bad shape. The replicas that we built was a replica that was built for I think my understanding, chief of I can't remember exactly the type, but the Lagos area back in the day commissioned an Afro-Brazilian to be built. That's in really good condition, taking care of it. So there is quite a few buildings that I also work with some students there to geolocate. But as I was being told, they're being lost almost like every year, because the other thing about where they are, most of these buildings were built around trading areas. Afro-Brazilians were trading. They were located near markets, near railway lines, so they occupied prime land in most of the areas, both in Togo, in Lome, where I was there, it's the same, in prime areas. In Porto Novo, it's the same. So because they occupy prime land and they're not being taken care of, there's demand for space. So to your point, I don't think a lot of them would survive, especially the privately owned one. They're just going to be demolished and build something new. The other thing about how current current buildings, or maybe attitude. Let me talk about attitude. I haven't done a survey specific about the current attitude of people towards colonial buildings, but some of the conversations that I've been having with community leaders, with students, again, it's not a survey to speak to, but generally people kind of value. So the question is, the investment and the effort that it will take for some of these to be preserved. In Benin, there is a new municipal board that's been established in Porto Novo to first they're creating like a documentation process where a building is designated as heritage, you can't touch it. But then there's no resources to say, well, if I can't touch it, what should I do with it? So a lot of the building owners that own these buildings, they're facing a situation where you let the building fall apart because you don't have the funding to maintain them, or you just say, well, I'm going to sell this off and move on. So the last image that I showed there with the house that I was working with community, those are the owners of an Afro-Brazilian building where they've been waiting for 10 years to get funding from the city to stabilize the building, and now it's falling apart. So the point is that attitudes, people want to keep this building, they want to honor them. Lack of resources, lack of support are the kind of main challenges, really. So I know I'm talking to speak here, but I've been kind of going back and forth, especially in Benin for 3 years now, and I haven't encountered a scenario where either it's a community leader or talking to government officials where there is a bad connotation towards colonial. There's still stories that they want to preserve, and that's another challenge. Like, some of these buildings you can't find who built it, how it was built. So all of those narratives are lost, and they do want to preserve them. So I think the attitude are positive. It's the resources that are not always.
There's a question in the chat, and maybe with this we can start wrapping up. But okay, it's a long question. I'll try my best to summarize, Amina. How do we rebuild pride and confidence in our culture and heritage when we are systematically taught to see it as primitive or undesirable, especially considering the changes brought by religious imperialism and the forced modernization to Western architectural styles? I'll stop there. Okay, that's what we have.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think you already answered beautifully in the chat as well.
Oh, wonderful. Do you wanna read it out loud, maybe for the audience here? Do you want me to, Nmadili?
Oh, you can read it. That's fine.
Sounds better with your voice, but I'll try. So rebuilding pride will be implemented by parents, teachers, friends, policymakers, everyone. Our curriculums must change. It's a gradual process, but it can be done. So it's a positive note, I would say. If you wanna say some final thoughts.
I think this was really great conversation. I don't think we conclude with any specific thoughts today, but I just want us all to think over. I personally, have these conversations in studios, while doing research or traveling. We hope to follow up with a summary of these conversations to make it available for everyone. I'd like to again extend the invitation to come to the other panels, which are happening in January. If you work with students, if you know anyone, please spread the word, because we want to, spend more time thinking about it. We're going to invite experts from different parts of the world, virtual events, so it can be more interactive and extended conversation. With that, thank you so much for coming. We would be around as much as possible for the informal conversations. But, thank you all. Have a wonderful week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nmadili.
All right.
Follow up. We'll speak to you soon.
Definitely.
Take care.
Okay, then. All right.